Hello, Houston. My name is Rick Cashaw. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Houston, which is where we're producing this course for you. And we'll hope to work with you through the semester to put together what I think is going to be a pretty interesting course. Cognitive psych is very hard to teach poorly because there's so much interesting material to get into, and we'll try to share some of that with you as we move along here through the semester. Before I show you a picture of me, which is deliberate, I want you to listen to me for a few minutes and then make some guesses about me. As you listen now, for instance, I'm sure that you can tell that I'm male, I hope, and that I'm slightly nervous. I may be breathing a little hard because I had to bike ride back over to my office just before we did the tape for various reasons. So in any case, we're grounded down, ready to go. But what else can you tell about me just from listening to me when you can't yet see me? Can you guess, for instance, am I a native of the U.S.? And if I'm from the U.S., what region? But let's look at some various other things that I'm going to ask you to predict here. I'm going to give you a starting image there, and then let's walk through a few things and see how well you can actually do this. So for instance, what's your guess about my, for instance, weight? Just from listening to me, am I a skimpy 160? I'm in an eating program to build me up. Am I 210 or 220? Or was I actually wheeled in here in a cart to be able to lecture this morning? So make a guess about my weight. Put it in the margin of your notes there. Secondly, what about my height? Am I going to be shrimpy, standing at the desk here that I'm talking from? Or am I something over 7 feet being recruited actively by the Rockets right now for a fantastic salary? I dream. How about my age? Just from listening to me, how old would you guess I am? 20? A nervous graduate student? 60, almost retired? 80, brought out of retirement because they didn't have somebody to do this class? What do you think? 20, 60, or 80? And then how about my race? What do you think it is? Black? White? Red? Yellow? Blue? Make a guess about my race. And then finally, of the list that I'm going to suggest, what about my nationality? Where do you think I'm actually from? And then using that kind of limited amount of evidence, what other conclusions do you think you could make about me? Anything else that occurs to you as something that you'd be willing to tolerate a guess about? Okay? So I'm actually asking you to make 5 different predictions about me. Make a guess about my weight, my height, my age, my race, my nationality, and anything else you want to throw in. Do I chew bubble gum? Okay? So that's what I've asked you to do. Now let's actually look at the answers. Okay? And that's what you're working with. Okay? So when you go through the answers, what you'll find is that height, it's about 5'10 and a half, shorter by an inch than I was when I was 25. So you guys are climbing into, most of you, into prime time. At 25, you're as tall as you're ever going to be, and it's downhill the rest of the way. So enjoy the ride. At least getting there is fun. My height is, I covered that. The weight I've covered, no, I didn't. I'm doing this in the reverse order. Don't have notes here. My weight is 210, and it better be dropping. That also better accompany my height downward a little bit here during the course of the semester, but we'll see. Age, any guess? 67 and 365ths or something like that. My birthday's coming up here very shortly, but I'm 67 at the moment. Race, obviously Caucasian, but that leads to an interesting argument. You could do a whole course just on trying to define race, and it turns out there are theorists that I can point out to you that will argue there's only one race divided in very interesting ways, and there's some that will argue passionately up to 11 different individual races. So there are people that endorse anything from 1 to 11 races, but I'm going to just claim to be somewhere in the middle in the Caucasian area. And nationality, obviously U.S., or not obviously U.S., I don't know. I probably talk too fast to be from deep south, but that leads to an interesting set of observations. And so basically, if you look at what was actually going on as you were looking at these various things, one of the things that was kind of interesting was the location of where I actually come from. And I had, in graduate school, when I was going to school at the University of Tennessee, I'll never forget, we had to take 2 courses outside of our major for the PhD. And so I selected speech pathology audiology just because I was interested in it. And there was about a 65-year-old little old lady, literally, who stood up and kind of peeked over the lectern and announced that she'd been doing it forever, and her job, and that she was able to listen to people and within 30 seconds hit within 2 counties of where you grew up. Well, I could not resist the temptation to rise to that challenge because I was actually, I'll just trace it very quickly for you. Born in New Jersey, raised in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which if you are familiar with it is an atomic city. It's a sociological freak because it's people from all over the country. And it's in the Deep South, and I love it. But it's not a Deep South city in terms of language. High school in New York, upstate New York. College at the University of Rochester, master's at Iowa, and I was then entering the PhD program at Tennessee. So I was coming through Tennessee for the second time. I put my hand up. She started me with a whole bunch of different words and sentences and various kind of combinations, and she started guessing at Chicago and went concentrically around it, kind of in broadening her circle. The only thing she ever hit that I'd ever been in was Iowa as a state, by no means the county. So we came to agree that maybe there were certain observations that you couldn't always predict, and so that's kind of what I'm going to be working on with you in this class. I'm going to suggest that all of us are constantly observing behavior. We use very small bits of information and remarkably subtle cues to make inferences about one another in a wide variety of ways, and that includes all manner of the language we use, even covert communication, which also turns out to communicate a lot about ourselves, and it's one of the things we'll look at in our analysis of cognitive psychology. How smart someone is, all sorts of things. But there are those are just some of the many processes that we're going to try and get involved in what we're studying here. So there are also many processes that rely on your memory, your skill with language, and your ability to solve problems, all topics that we'll be covering during the course of this course. So what are your goals for the course? What would you like to get out of this other than an A? I mean, everybody has A as the goal. That's obvious. But how about content mastery? Have you looked at that as a possibility? Some are in psychology, for instance, in preparation for moving into clinical psychology or clinical neuropsychology, one of the more exciting new areas in our discipline. And they're likely to have more interest in application than in science, undergirding that than in the science that undergirds that application. So if you're watching at home or enjoying an internet presentation of this, you might want to just stop the thing for a minute and sit there and think for a moment about what you're really looking for in this class, in cognitive psychology. And there are a variety of different possibilities. Suggest. By the way, for those of you that are in the studio, you need to mash a button that says something like talk or speak on those microphones. It will turn you on in very exciting ways, but mainly it'll connect you to the rest of the world through the television tapes. So why are you here? Yes, it's a requirement. I know that. But what else? I'm going to wait. See, I'm already paid, so when you guys go mum, I'll just go mummer. I'll outweight you. Give me some ideas. Why are you here? I'm going to outweight you. You've paid good money to sit here and watch me watch you, or we can interact. Why do you want to be here? Yeah. Make sure you press the button on the mic. Thank you. Push it and hold it while you talk.
Okay. Well, I'm here because of the requirements for psychology. I think there's 3 classes I could choose from, and this one seemed like a very interesting topic that I would enjoy, and I'm pretty sure whatever I had in mind for this course, I way over my head because I don't know.
Okay, well that's an A. Anybody else want? Thanks. I think that's an equally legitimate kind of reason to be in here. The goal basically is going to focus on the study of normal cognitive behavior. I'm not going to get into the speech pathology, audiology stuff in any way, but what I'm going to try and do is to attempt to develop and refine for you the manner in which you observe and then analyze not only your own but others' behavior when it involves encoding perceptual processes, memory, imagery, general knowledge, language, both in its acquisition and in its use, and some of the many complex processes that are built on language. I can think, for instance, of things like creativity, obviously language-based in many ways. Problem solving is another example. Reasoning, decision-making. All of that ultimately requires some vehicle by which to think, and language is a key element of being able to do that. And so as you gain in skill in language, you find that your ability to think in general, abstract and increasingly complex thoughts, also grows. We'll talk later about language development, but just as a hint of what's going on, basically in terms of language skills, I think it would be defensible to say that when you reach age 5, you already have mastered enough of the rules to be able to speak the language with as much facility, with as much adequacy as you and I can do at our ages. And the only two things that really increase after about age 5 in language are the number of words that you have, your vocabulary size, and the length of the sentences that you use. We'll look at that later in the semester. But basically language beyond age 5, most of the action is done by age 5, and really all you're doing beyond age 5 is beginning to practice longer sentences and all the things that opens up to you as the complexity of your thinking increases. So basically course goals for me are going to involve, first of all, trying to introduce you to what psychologists can contribute to your knowledge of cognitive psychology, first of all. Secondly, the kinds of behavior that are studied by cognitive psychologists. Thirdly, I'm meant to bring an instruction with me. In fact, I'll stop to describe here for a minute. Kinds of behaviors that are studied by cognitive psychologists. I had a cold over the intercession break between last semester and this, and it was one of those head-filling colds. You tipped down at night to sleep and immediately you couldn't breathe. So I finally went to the doctor after about 3 days, and I got a medicine to clear up the nasal passages. The instructional sheet on that came out of the little box that you paid $25 for was about that big. And I'd challenge you to do a word count on that. I'll bet there are 5,000 words on that sheet of paper. You literally have to use a magnifying glass to read that thing. And that's, if you look at that as a language act, it really is not intended to communicate. As I thought about it, I finally decided that what was really going on there is a legal defense, because they actually had a chemical structure of the molecules that were, composing the pills that I had bought. And as I began to think about it, I realized, most of this stuff has to do with one biochemist talking to another, or one lawyer talking to another. They're really not trying to give you detailed instructions, this much times 5,000 words as to when to take the pill at 8 o'clock or 8:03 or anything like that. But the finished product really said loads about what it was actually intended to do, other than the instructions, which it said it was at the top. Thirdly, what I'm going to look at is the terminology and the principles that cognitive psychologists are in the process of developing. And then finally, the techniques and procedures that we use in these studies. And there's an amazing array of different kinds of studies we'll be looking at here during the semester. Secondly, what I'm going to have you try to do is to gain appreciation for the lawfulness of human cognitive behavior. Okay? I was, for instance, willing to start the tape today without you being able to see me, firm in the knowledge that you, having already paid the money to get into the course, that you would give me enough rope to hang myself before you made a decision about whether I was a good instructor or not, and this was a worthwhile course. So I deliberately kind of started with a blank screen, knowing that you would in fact stick with me. That's part of the lawfulness of student behavior. It relates to something we'll talk about a little later. Have you ever paid $8 or $9 or $10 to get into a movie which 30 minutes into it you hate, that you don't like? Are you gutsy enough to walk out? Most people don't in that situation. It's kind of, you got your foot into it, so, well, I paid for it, I better go through this. So what you've basically done is to buy yourself 2 hours of agony. And rather than cut it off at 30 minutes of agony and go do something fun for the other hour and a half, most of us will sit through there and then walk out fussing to make sure nobody else ever does that. But that's the kind of thing we'll be looking at, are some of the decision processes we use and the ways in which we get into it. So I'm going to argue in favor of the lawfulness of our cognitive behavior. And finally, what I hope to do is to demonstrate and relay to you some of the practical applications, skills that can be helpful in day-to-day living for years to come, based on the various research that's done under the general label, the generic label of cognitive psychology. In short, this is an introduction to cognitive psychology, with one significant wrinkle for many of you. It's offered on the internet or by television. So you can poke fingers at me and wave at me and do anything you want. I'll never know. So you're safe to do anything you want while you're watching. It'd be nice to pay attention, but you can do almost anything else. It's amazing how flexible your end is going to be. And so what I'd like to do is to look at television classes in terms of some of the problems we will have with them, some of the mixed blessings that are involved, and some of the absolute out-and-out blessings. So what I'd like to do is go to the monitor, the Super Ray, whatever they call it. PowerPoint's the word I'm looking for. And in essence, as we look at television courses in general, they're big, first of all, but that brings some problems with it. The two most obvious ones are essentially that direct contact is lost. It seems to be lost because there are so many people that may be watching at any given time. And that could be a problem. But what I'm going to suggest is that although there seems to be a lack of direct face-to-face contact, in fact, there are a number of solutions that I can suggest to you. One is that most of what I cover is in the assigned text, which I'll talk about here a little bit later. Secondly, you are by now far enough into your college education that you come to appreciate that the major source that you turn to, unlike in high school where you simply go back to the teacher and ask for help, normally what happens now is you either go to a friend, which turns out to be the #1 source for most people. You know, they said there were 4 points supporting this and I only got 3. Did you know what the other one was? What do you think it was? Or you go to a graduate teaching assistant, and then rarely you'll track down the professor, okay, and go to us. But it's kind of reversed what it used to be. You'd go to colleagues now rather than the professor at first shot. And I thank you for that because I'm in the process of writing the tapes as we go. So I'm a little busy this semester. But by all means, in general, what I would suggest is when you're paying a professor's salary, you ought to make sure that A, you learn how to do research and things related to mastering the discipline. But the other thing is, don't forget that we are paid to teach. If you actually go look at the contract that we sign, the main thing it talks about is not research, but teaching, which is interesting. Because many of us get kind of stuffy about, oh, I can only talk to you between 11:03 and 1:06. You know. Don't take that for an answer. They're earning their salary to teach you whatever course you're in, so harass them a little bit. Let them earn their pay. It'll be better that way, and you'll learn the discipline better. But talk to somebody. We have at least 1 and sometimes as many as 3 instructional assistants helping me with this class, and we will get that information out to you in detail as rapidly as we can. So there will be people there to help you and answer your questions at any given time, probably by email. That is the most effective way to do it, because then, first of all, you've got a record that you sent, that you asked for some help, and then secondly, that's also probably the most efficient way to get an answer back to your question in most cases. And as a last resort, of course, you can come back and visit me. That's okay, no problem. The second thing is that it's fleeting, okay? It's here and it's gone very, very rapidly. And that's a problem in college in general. You've by now come to appreciate that the knowledge flow is probably 3 or 4 times the rate at which you process concepts in a high school class. It's just you're in another level now. And there again, I'm going to suggest a couple of different things. First of all, to solve that problem, and it is a problem, what you want to do, well, in fact, let me demonstrate before that. I've been waving my hands around in front of you now for 10 or 15 minutes. Am I or am I not wearing any rings? Have you watched closely enough to know that? So if you had to vote yes or no, how many of you would vote positive? Just do it by show of hands, not on the mic. Okay, the vast majority are saying wearing a ring or rings, probably meaning based on the decision, well, he looks marriageable. I don't know how it is, but so you're voting yes. Okay, let's do a little harder thing then. How many? 1, 2, or 3? We've agreed it's not none. How many would vote 1 ring? How many would vote 2 rings? How many would vote 3 rings or more? Well, you're not wrong by much. It's 1 rather than 2. But let's push you a little harder, because remember, we're teaching observational skills here. What color is it? Is it silver, gold, or uranium? What do you, platinum? That's the word I was looking for. How many would go with gold? How many would go with silver? How many would go with some other tarnished color? Well, you're right, it's gold. Okay. How many of you are wearing silver jewelry? Interesting. What's happened, an interesting shift that has occurred over the last 5 or 10 years, is the fact that it used to be that the vast majority of people wearing silver would still vote gold. even when they couldn't see in a large lecture that I teach, when they couldn't see what the actual correct answer was. And that ratio has dropped gradually. Maybe it's just that gold has finally become the ring color to, or the jewelry color to wear, material to wear. But in any case, the key is going to be, and it is 1, that's the correct answer. In essence, the solutions are, first of all, to watch and listen carefully, critically. Because you've got in television land, internet land, you've got a unique possibility that you can schedule it when you're ready. And I'll have some suggestions on when best to do that and how a little bit later. But you can really do it at a time when you're ready for it, and that's helpful. Secondly, take notes, but listen and analyze. Because I've got a book that I'll be talking about later that has already done the writing for you, so you need to do the thinking part. That's what we're relying on you for. And ask a friend or one of us. So if you do genuinely miss something, you can either hit the rewind button or go ask somebody, okay? Because we do want you to get the material. That's what we're paid to relay, and we're going to try and do our job through the semester here. Now, there are also some mixed blessings in terms of what we're looking at. Fleetingness I've talked about, but let's also look at mixed blessings. One of which is information flow, and I'm doing this in a slightly different way. What I mean, not like fleetingness, but rather information flow. I'm talking really about the rate at which words are being piled on you. More so not words, but concepts, okay? And what we're going to try and do as the course is developed is that the course is built around specified objectives, specifiable objectives. But the critical information in general will be spaced out. I will highlight on the outline I'll be using in the, well, as you can see here, obviously the key that we're talking about is television, but then under that the main headings will be held so that, you know, sometime past when I've talked about it, so that you'll have the time to see the overall flow of what I'm doing in the class. That's a deliberate feature designed in there to help with the chunking of the information for you. And then finally, another course that is another mixed blessing is that sometimes the course it comes with a bag of expectations. People in general like psychology, and sometimes they lose track of the fact that it is also a social science class. And so we will be teaching this as a science. I don't think you're going to kind of just blow through it, because there will be some pretty complex fundamental processes about which we're talking here. But related to that, the violating of normal expectations, I would not argue that one of the things that's sometimes associated with cognitive is that it's a hard class. Well, my goal is to make hard into easy, basically, to present it to you in a way that you can first of all digest it and then think about it and then fire back at me with anything you don't understand. So don't walk away with the idea that it's a manifestly hard class. It isn't. It's packaged in a way that it's easily masterable if you will take the time to do it. That's the key. You've got to get some input to get some output. Now, in terms of the other thing we need to talk about, and that is the delights, in fact, the sheer delights associated with television. There are a couple of different ones. If you will make an effort to achieve it, you will find that you and I can form a very close working relationship, closeness in several different ways. I have a demonstration that I do sometimes that I won't waste your time with this time, but we do a broad shot, we then do a chest up shot, and then we do just my mouth. And I ask you in each case, have you ever been that close to your college instructor? Well, the answer is, in terms of the mouth shot, you can actually be that close, okay? Sit as close as you want to the television set, won't bother me at all, whatever. But we will form a relatively close working relationship in the next many months. That's the major delight that I wanted to cite, the closeness, but there are a couple of others. I'll be talking in a few minutes about the book called Cognitive Psych, the book, which is a set of topical notes that will help you in getting through things here. We'll also be looking at Matlin's cognition text, and I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. But if we look at the course ratings, these are the kind of things, particularly the second and third, that are most frequently rated as positives in the course. The visual aids, people often comment on because there's a secret behind that. I have lousy handwriting, and I used to have the big lecture halls and big green boards, and I would write massive things, and if you stood in the back of the classroom, you couldn't understand what I'd written on the board. So I love PowerPoint, and it will be on all the time. May not always be on the screen, but it will be visible most of the time so that you can make sure, I can make sure that you understand what I'm actually talking about. We're going to talk about the project I'm going to ask you to do, and I will try to build some element of the course around that. In fact, for those of you who are taking the course now, if you'll go to the previous version of the course and jump back to one of the last tapes, You'll find some samples of what I'm talking about that, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Listen to me. The next lecture, when I go through the basic mechanics of the course. Now I'm just talking general structure, but we'll do basic mechanics in the next tape. And the final thing, time permitting, that I'm going to try and do is that we have a large faculty, and there turns out to be a language program, which is rather interesting in and of itself. It's an interdepartmental program. So we're going to be talking to some people from English, some people from computer science potentially, or engineering, and we'll be also talking about some of our faculty in psychology. So if I've got the time, I'll try to bring in some experts in the specific areas that we're talking about, let you perhaps bounce some questions off them and so forth. So those are the kind of features that we've kind of built into the course that will potentially make it a little easier for you and more interesting. Let me see where I am here, and then let's look ahead as hints to survive and thrive. That's kind of what I'm focused on here. I'm going to do 2 series of these. Today's will be essentially related to the content of the course. And the thing I'm going to talk about here is the first, text. And that is one key element of how you survive in this class. Okay? The book that we're going to be using right now in this course this year is this one. It's just come out. So the likelihood is that it will be out for several years of use of the tape. I will always, if it changes copyright date, shift when the new book comes out to the newest version. But I like Margaret Matlin. We have a taped interview of her from a couple of taped sessions back, and we may be able to dig that up, and if I will, we'll drop it in, because she has a really interesting summary of her first chapter. I will give it to you near the end of, I think, the second lecture is when I get to it, but if we can't, we'll just let Margaret Matlin describe it, because it's a fascinating presentation, logic that she has for how she wrote the book. And so that's one book that you can definitely use, the Matlin's Cognition. It's not a very complex title, just Cognition. That's what she's writing about. But while we've got the camera there, let me show you a couple of other possibilities. We will be using Matlin's cognitive book, but there are a couple of others that are rather interesting. One of them is, did I put that up right? It's rather goofy the way it's set up. That's a book by Robert Sternberg. It's now in its 5th edition. And if you don't like Margaret Matlin's style or whatever, go get Sternberg's. It's a higher level book, and it gets into some complexities that I didn't want to deal with at the 3000 level. But that's another possibility. And I'll suggest even one other for you, and that is a book by Stephen Reed. Interestingly enough, I made these selections of kind of sample other texts several years ago. In fact, when we did the original version, there's one other by Stephen Reed that has just come out in its 7th edition. 3 out of the 4 books that I selected at that time to mention are still in publication. And that's through a time when publication has gone through a lot of collapsing. So we must have actually done a pretty good job of selecting other good cognitive psych books. But in essence, these are a sample of a few of the ones that will be important that you might want to consider as alternatives if you really just don't like Matlin's approach. But that'll be what we're dealing with in terms of the text. I will make a couple of suggestions next time about how to use that book most effectively, but make sure that you do get the text. And as I tell people, well, I'll tell you a little bit later. I've got a kind of a summary statement on that. All of them, regardless of which one you use, are going to include general notes regarding are going to include some other comments. That is let me start again. I lost my place in the notes. The content of all of those books, high-level, frequently used cognitive psych books, is going to be essentially identical. The nuances will differ. They may package the material a little differently, but in general, a cognitive psych book is going to cover the major elements of cognitive psych, which you can see by looking at the topical outline of the course that we're teaching here. You may also want to try to get a study guide to accompany the text that you have if you're not using Matlin. Matlin's is rather interesting because of the fact she does not have a study guide. Okay, there is a book that is published, however, that is available. I looked at it just last night on the web, and you can get 2 copies of what's called CogLab online version. Normally, I'll have a reference on the screen when I'm presenting something like this. I didn't have time to pull all the relevant information together, but it's written by Greg French and Ian Neath, N-E-A-T-H. That is such a tempting name with which to play. Can you imagine Neath as your last name? You've met his cousin, of course, Under, and his wife, B. Oh, I won't get into it. It's so tempting. But it's by, again, it's by Francis and Neath. It's on the internet, and it's called CogLab. It's in its second edition, and the ratings of it are really quite good. I stumbled across a student who had, it was unfortunate, I couldn't interpret it. One of the students in Matlin's class had just had the class last semester relative to when this is being taped, and he spoke in there about the fact that he found a very valuable book. As near as I could tell, this was the one, but I know generally the ratings on this are like 4.5 to 5 stars out of users. So this would be a good supplement if you want a kind of a hands-on computer-based addition to the course that we're using. Again, it's Francis and Neath. I will make sure that I get the reference itself into the course outline by next semester. So number one is the text itself. That's a hint of what you need to survive in this class. Number two, we're going to go back to the list and we're going to show you number two, which is basically a set of notes, a good set of notes. All right? So what you're going to record as you take notes, and by juniors, this should be a review for you, not anything new. But I'm going to go over it to make sure you've been told, because there is a way to get through college very successfully, and this class. Okay? What you do is to record the key concepts. If the instructor starts the class by saying good morning and you can hear pens scratching already, that is somebody who is taking too many notes. Okay? What you really need to do is to concentrate on the theme that's being talked about, not the words that are being used. And I'll have some more comments on that when it comes to study suggestions. Secondly, you want to look at the flow of logic. What is the flow by which things are being, why are they packaged in the way they are? Because normally with most instructors, as with me, there's a logic to why I go through things in the way I do. And that's the reason I'm going to be using the kind of system you're already seeing an example of on the screen there. And that is the concept I've already talked about, at least some reminder of it will still be there, even as we've moved on to the next topic through the course of the semester here. You also want to pay attention to definitions and terms. That's easier now. It's a killer in introductory psych and in any introductory course because you have to speak the language before you can learn the subject. And that's just a kind of an inherent problem built into introductory courses. But with cognitive, we'll be focused much more specifically on a particular kind of vocabulary related to language or thought or any of the various things that we're looking at. But pay attention to the definitions and terms. Those are natural temptations for any quiz, okay, is to define the terms that we're talking about. So let's look a little bit just at a reminder, and you may not have come through my introductory class since, or a introductory class, since this has really been formalized in any significant ways. I'm actually citing stuff from a book that was written 50 years ago, published almost 50 years ago now. It's by James Deese and his wife Ellen K. Deese, D-E-E-S-E. The copyright, believe it or not, is only 1994, so it's a decade or more old at this point, but it has been in continuous print since 1954. So that book has been continuously printed since 1954. That's telling you that it's a good book. And I've got a comment that I wanted to make to you about it. Sorry, I said 54, it was 59. So it's approaching a half century of usage, essentially, already established. It may be too low level for you. That is at the junior level, in junior senior level in college education. But a Canadian reviewer, Laurie Rennie, commented, which I do think is right on target. She commented about the book as I found it in looking it up on the internet to check its availability. And that is, what she says is, and I'm quoting here directly, when it comes to study tips, it is very helpful to some degree. However, it is obviously focused solely on the young student, with a higher rate of midlife changes and mature, and let me try that again, with a higher rate of midlife changes and mature students coming in, it seems to ignore the lifestyles and demands that they have to contend with while studying, such as family obligations or financial responsibilities beyond themselves or even management of time between studying and family. I would not recommend it for a mature student. But the general strategy on how to study is very good in that book. Witness, it's been around for half a century. Okay, I won't review all of it, but 3 suggestions from that are worth noting. And they're not going to be numbered in quite that sequence. But basically what I do want to look at is the following. That is, what is included in that book, in one section of it, has to do with developing a, wait a minute, I've got the wrong thing up here. Hang on with me just a second here. No, I guess we can do it. Scheduling. What I want you to do is note-taking. I've got a problem here, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because I'm going to cover it. I think it's out of order here, but we'll fix it up later if we have to. Hang on a second here. Okay, so what we're going to look at is note-taking, and what it recommends is that you put in a vertical line 2 inches down from the top, okay, on any sheet you're going to take notes on. Secondly, what you do is to put a horizontal line about an inch, not as far out, as an inch or an inch and a half up from the bottom, inch and a quarter. You don't have to take that much room with that because it's for a purpose. It'll be obvious here in a minute. And then what you're going to do is to essentially take your notes here. The key, the thing that makes this system work is the next point. And that is that what this system recommends is that the next thing you do is to go in and recode the notes that you've taken. And that's really the key to making this work, because what it says is, what it's recommending is, and it's very solid psychology, that what you do after taking the notes in whatever language you're using, maybe just copying directly from the instructor, take the time to go back and reread those notes before the next class and put them in your words. The other suggestion that's key is that when you have that line down the left side, if you may have 250 words on, I mean, you know what your notes are like, but there tend to be a lot of words per page. What's recommended by these authors is that you not have more than 5, at the most 10 words in that recode line section. What that does is to provide an instant test for you, because then when you're studying later, getting ready for learning the material, in the process of learning the material, one very effective way to see whether you know it or not is, can you fold your notes so that all you can see is the back of your note paper and the recode section? And can you read down through each of the coded words in order and remember what idea is reflected there? So that take the recode section and use that as a kind of an informal test and test your mastery that way. Think how much easier that could make your studying if you don't have to review 250 words at a shot. You can instead do it 5 or 10 words. Lightens the load a lot on your head if it's organized that way, in such a way that this will then cue you to the information you need to recall. So that's really, that left-right is the primary thing that makes this system as good as it is. And then what also happens is that at the bottom, what may happen to you is that you write notes, and in the feverishness of taking them in listening to the lecture, you realize when you get home to review it later that, whoops, the instructor said there were 3 primary causes leading to the Civil War in the United States of America, 1860 to 1865, and you look at your notes and you've only got 2. Okay? That's a good reason to write down at the bottom a question, what's number 3? Okay? And ask it at the beginning of the next lecture. Don't wait until the end of the semester, because things are probably a lot more complex by then. The other thing is that is recommended by these authors is that what you do is add comments in that section relevant to the information that you're mastering. Okay? I reorganized one section of one of my courses based on a comment and question that a student asked that made a better argument for a way to present material. And so don't treat this whole thing like rocks that we're just pouring gravel into your head for you to use. Think of it instead as ideas that are debatable. Not everybody in my department agrees with the introductory course I teach. I don't agree with everything taught by all my colleagues in psychology. We're not supposed to agree. In fact, what really makes the academic environment so exciting is it's a place to debate, to argue. I like my presentation, you like yours, let's do it face to face and compare it. Let's make some decisions about it. But it requires thinking about it. You interact about it. But the comments can be very helpful to instructors and maybe to other students as you're going through it. Okay? So the third thing that you need then is a plan of study of some sort. Okay? And that is where I'm now going to get to what I thought was going to come up a little earlier. If I'd reviewed these notes one more time, I might have had things in the correct order. But in any case, what we'll eventually need to do, that's what I was expecting to show up a little earlier, but we'll get to it. In any case, what I would recommend you do, and I've recommended this even in my introductory course, and people who eventually do it come to understand the wisdom, but I'm going to suggest it again just because not enough people do it already. And that is that I want you to just take a week, create a schedule for yourself. I would suggest takes about a 1/4 inch if you divide the day into 24 hours. You can do it on the front and the back of a page, or block out the sleep time. Don't have to worry about recording notes then. But put the days of the week across the top, the hours of the day down the side. The key to make this work is, remember, this is not being done for me, it's being done for you. And what I'm leading to is time management, but this is the way I'm going to get to it. So what you do is just whenever you get up, I don't know when it is, start keeping notes roughly every 30 minutes so that you can, at the end of the day, by looking at that list very quickly, reconstruct it. So your day. So what I'm suggesting is that if you want to write, I went to the grocery store, don't do that, okay? That's not the way to do it, okay? Just use one word, store. Are you likely to think that at 6:30 in the morning you went out and bought a grocery store? No. The word store will tell you that'll cue you as to what happened. It was the activity of going there, getting the breakfast you forgot to get the day before, or whatever, okay? So keep it simple as you're doing it. So instead of I had a grand lunch or breakfast with, don't worry about that. Eat is the activity, okay? So that's what I want you to put in there. It's just the word eat, just to cue yourself. And then in essence, what you're going to do is to summarize all of your activities over time. Eat, sleep, and sex. If anything else interesting happens, you'll probably find a word for it, okay? But keep it simple, because what I'm going to suggest that you do is on the back of that sheet, summarize your time in terms of general categories. For instance, for a typical undergraduate at the introductory course level, what I do is take about 8 or 9 activities that all of us are engaged in as undergraduates. Eating, sleeping, studying, I hope, working. There may be religious activities, there can be social activities, and there are 1 or 2 other things. But you can really summarize most undergraduate lives, and working is another one, obviously. So there are 8 or 9 categories that pretty well characterize most of our lives at the most general level. And that's really what I'm after, because it's the study time that I'm particularly interested in. So you may find after you've done this for a week and summarized it, that you're only studying, say, 6 hours a week. And when you look at that schedule, you may find out, well, gee, isn't that interesting? I study from 2 to 4 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I don't know whether that fits your schedule, but maybe that's what you find. And you're thinking to yourself, well, gee, I studied, I studied 6 hours, and that's really not what I meant to do. You meant to study 12 or 20. The average, if you study 20 hours a week for people who are taking 15 credit hours, that is the standard load, you're studying more than 2/3 of the students enrolled here at the University of Houston as a typical state university, because a lot of you work and a lot of you have a lot of distractions. That's one of the things we're going to work on eliminating, okay? But the key is that basically, if you can plan to do 20 hours a week, you will be well up in the number of hours most people spend studying. And I'm not going to discourage you from doing more, but you might think of 20 as at least a target figure to get to. So if you find in your schedule that you've spent 6, don't jump from 6 to 20 immediately, okay? That's too big a change in your lifestyle to make and live with. What I would suggest instead is that what you do is to, if you, just for instance, if you do study 2 to 4, 3 days a week, add 30 minutes at the end. Do 2 to 4:30 each day. You've moved an hour and a half, not each day, but each of those 3 time blocks. If you're already set up to study, take advantage of it. Add 30 minutes at the end. Now you're doing 7.5 hours. Add half an hour at the end, at the beginning the next week. Now you've moved 6 hours, the total amount of time that you spent studying. You've now, no, that's wrong, that's 3. I get my math mixed up there. But what I'm suggesting is that you lead into that process of gradually changing. And what you're doing basically is time management. You're setting up how you're going to spend your time, and that's what's going to determine your success here in all of the classes that you're in. But take the time to do that. And then I have one other thing to recommend for you, and I know you're guilty. I can just tell it in your eyes. Oh, here was the figures I didn't know I was going to show to you. That's pretty much the normal range of data that was collected at another state university near here. It's not a Texas school, but it's a very comparable school to ours. And you can see and that was the only people who were tallied were those that were carrying 15 hours or more. So that's a pretty typical load of what most people tend to do. So in any case, there we are. Let's go back and try that then. Sorry I put this in the wrong order for you, but we'll talk about it here. Basically, the study technique I'm going to recommend is SQ3R. How many of you in the room here are already familiar with it, just by show of hands? SQ3R. Well, this is something you might want to invest some time in, particularly if you're headed into graduate school, which many people in cognitive psych are. It's a technique in that same Dease and Dease book, surprisingly enough, that's been around, tried and true a long time. Some people call it the SQ4R, the SP3R. You know, there's several different views, but it's essentially the same thing in each case. S in this is survey. That's what it stands for. What it's recommending is that when you're reading material, any new material, textual material, the first thing you do is survey it. Some people do it just by looking at the bold. Some people do it by reviewing the table of contents. You can do it a lot of different ways. But just 2 minutes looking at it, just so you know where you're headed. That's all. Secondly, you ought to be now at the place where you can ask questions of yourself. When you're coming into material and you survey it, you can ask questions that you yourself are interested in finding an answer for. When you were required to go into this, that, and the other distribution course, it may not have been so easy. But if you're now a junior and you're having trouble asking questions in the courses you're asking, you may want to ask a more basic question like, what am I doing here? Because you may be wasting you or somebody else's money. But ask some questions that you want to get an answer to. That will personalize it for you, and as dumb as it sounds, it's very helpful in helping you master the material. If you read for specific answers, because you tend to be more focused in doing that. Third, you have to end up reading. There's no way to get around that. And fourth, you recite. Okay? This is the action part, and I'm going to come back and talk about that in a minute. But those are the two elements in this 5-part process that actually do the teaching, the learning is what I should say. This is where you do the learning, when you're reading it and then reciting it. By that I mean any closed book activity. You're outlining it, you're doing a vocabulary list if you're in language or something like that. You're developing a general set of principles. There are a variety of ways to do that, but that's the active part, reading and recitation. And then the review, which is the last part, is just that. That is, you're literally going over material that you already know. And in that sense, you can use review as kind of an integrator, an overall integrator of whatever you're trying to learn. So the reading and recitation is really the most interesting part. Now, this is going to surprise you a little bit. But what's recommended in that book 50 some odd years ago is the fact that for every hour you spend reading in any course, you ought to spend 4 hours reciting it in one way or another. And I'll just, for a minute, I'll jump a little bit off topic here to justify that figure for you, because I can see a couple of eyebrows that have gone up in the room as I'm talking here. But think about that a minute. Think about the last exam you took here at the U of H, okay? What do you have to do to get credit on an exam? Okay, and rather than do a discussion here, what I'm going to do is I'll just give you the answers. But basically, the first thing you have to do once you've read an exam question is you have to recall the answer. You have to recall whether you've got the information. That's number one activity. You can't think about the answer until you've recalled the information that you've got. Okay, and then you can fuss with whether I know enough to answer that question. So you have to recall it. The second thing you have to do with that knowledge is you have to apply it. Okay, so you take the information that you've gathered out of your head, organize it so that it can be applied to the answer that's needed on that exam. There's one other thing. It's self-generated, but we all do it to ourselves. And that is, you come into an exam, not so much in this class, but I know when I do review sessions in Intro Psych, sometimes these people come in with a glazed look on their face, and you can almost see in their head that what they're thinking to themselves is, I've got this thing almost mastered. But if I have to answer one question, the whole thing's going to collapse. Okay, there's this structure that's kind of there, but it's going to collapse if I have to think about it. So the solution to that, what I'm describing, is what's called high drive. Okay, you tend to come in to exams, students in general tend to come in under high drive. They're anxious, they're high pressure. That doesn't necessarily help learning, okay, or demonstrating learning. So in essence, to survive in an exam, you have to recall and apply under self-generated conditions of high pressure. Now think about it a minute. Are any of those three processes output? I just blew the whole demonstration. The question I meant to ask is, are any of those processes input? Redo the tape? No. But in essence, my point is made even more obvious by the screw-up, and that is that if you think about it, most students spend most of their time getting ready for an exam reading. That's an input process. You don't get credit for reading. You can read a gazillion books in any given class, but unless that knowledge is recallable and accessible and usable, it's useless when it comes to an exam. So the point that I was trying to bludgeon my way through here is that recall, application, and the conditions under which you do so are all conditions of output, not input. And that's the way you need to get ready for an exam, which is the reason the ratio is as high as it is in favor of recitation. So I've got a bad demonstration, I've belabored it enough, I will move past it. Oh me. I have one other thing to talk about. This gets a little personal. Think about your desk where you normally study. Can you reach at that desk a telephone? The ratio there is usually about 60% yes of those that will answer. Can you reach a radio or some other sound emission device? The ratio there is actually usually a little bit higher. Can you see on that desk or from the place where you normally sit to study pictures of family or travel posters or a memorandum, a memorabilia, some piece of memorabilia from a last dance or some other vacation activity? Well, what you're to do when you get home tonight is to form your arm and an elbow, and you are to take that desk and clean it. You are to remove as many things as you can other than pencils and staplers, okay? Because they're distractions. Anytime you spend thinking about that dance is time you're not spending studying the material you ought to be, okay? So clean it. Put it in a box, tape it up, and label it desk stuff and your name. Because it's important or it wouldn't be there. Well, on my desk that's not necessarily true. But get it out of the way, because you can always go back if you need it. But get it out of the way so it doesn't distract you. And then finally, only study at that desk. If you have to write a letter to somebody, do it somewhere else, okay? If you have to read a newspaper or a magazine or a book or something, do it somewhere else if it isn't directly related to studying. And what that does then is ultimately condition you so that when you sit down at the desk, you're all business. You've got yourself conditioned so that you're ready to do the job with no distractions. That will help your studying, okay? And then the last thing that I want to spend some time looking at here today is a rather interesting series of data that I found also in that book. It had been a long time since I went back and reviewed the Dease book, but it's well worth reading just for the general skills that are recommended, let alone the fact that it tends to be lower level in its presentation here. But good students, in general, are less likely to be able to think of things that would prevent them from doing their homework. They are more positive, action-oriented in their approach to how they're going through the individual material. Second thing, good students are less likely to have distractions on the desk, as we just talked about it. They are less likely to have a desk that is cluttered with other work, a radio, a telephone, all the different things that we talked about there. Okay? Thirdly, they are able to figure that they're less likely to skip the figures, okay? That is, that in essence, they figure that the figures are not just pictures. They are there, in fact, for a reason, okay? And their goal is not just to read words, okay? They are willing to take the time to look and understand the figures. That will also help, okay? They're less like, good students are less likely to skip the figures. They are less likely to stay up late, especially on the night before any exam, especially an important one. Personal story, a little bit off subject here. I started my career as an undergraduate as a pre-med, as an engineer, because my engineer-to-be is the best thing I can say, because my father was an engineer, and I figured if you're going to have friends and do things, you had to be an engineer. This was a high school student thinking. So I entered in engineering. But it turns out that the very first course at Rochester in engineering was mechanical drawing. At a time when you used to have those great big 6-foot wide desks about 4 feet tall with the sliding plastic bars so you could do very detailed hand drawings of blueprints, basically. Well, I have a tremor in my hand all the time. It's always there. Don't worry about it. And freehand drawing was okay as long as I had the thing to line it against. But in fact, freehand lettering, which of course you had to do to letter and label the diagrams, was simply out of the question for me. I mean, I couldn't do it. And so the faculty looked at what I'd done after a year and decided that maybe I'd be more effectively challenged in another major. So I went in to decide, okay, I'm going to do general science. And I tried that. And I did a run at Rochester. You were able to major in 3 or have a run of courses in 3 majors with enough high-level courses, and you could be a general science major. Good prep for pre-med. So I took chemistry, biology, and psychology and did a run of courses in each of those. And everything was fine until I got to organic chemistry in my senior year. And what happened there was that, in fact, Let me back up a little bit. I'm mixing a story here because I had 2 points I want to make. That's dangerous. You need to stick to the notes. The point was that I went into organic chemistry in January of my senior year, and I had an A at the beginning because I was good in chemistry. But by Christmas, it was down to a C minus. And at Rochester, you didn't get any grade for organic chemistry, which was an 8 credit hour course, until the end of the year. You got a grade midway to let you know how you were doing, but you didn't get the grade till the end. So I went into my advisor right away in January and said, I'm going to drop out of organic chemistry. And she got this long face, it's going to have bad effects on you. Well, I said, I'm going to change majors too. And so then she grinned a little more, and I ended up switching into psychology actually in January of my senior year. Okay, so the key there is to make sure that you prepare ahead of what's plan your early courses so that the later ones flow a little more naturally. And the place where I got off target was that I was starting to talk about staying up late, and that was the other thing that got me to change the original shift from engineering into general science occurred because I did an all-night prep for an exam in my sophomore year. It was a math class, which I never liked. The only course I ever flunked in college was calculus. And yet I've never scored less than 99th percentile on math ability tests. The reason is, if you look at them, they never go above high school math. And I can do high school math with my eyes shut, no problem. But calculus is abstract. And we'll talk about the effect of that. That's another cognitive psych effect that we'll spend a little time looking at. And so I ended up staying up all night for my first math exam and ended up blowing the curve at the bottom end, not the top end. The problem was that I'd stayed up so long with the intention tremor I have. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I'm holding my hands still now for me. Okay, it's always been there, so I just work around it. But in any case, I had a couple of shots of Coke, the drink, Coca-Cola, I mean. I'd had some coffee in the morning to make sure I'd still be awake and so forth. And the problem was that by the time I got into that exam at 10 in the morning, I was so wired that it took me 30 minutes of 50 even to be able to pick the pencil up, and 10 more before I could register it in those stupid little dotted lines of the multiple choice tests. Hence, I didn't score very well on that. Well, my bill-paying father looked at those results and said, get thee to a psychologist, a counseling psychologist for career development is what he was suggesting. So we went in and took the interest test and everything else. And that was the first time, when I'd not even had it yet, that I was told that I had the potential for a PhD in psychology. Okay, never having had the class. So I took it next time and it worked. And that's the reason I ended up switching into psychology eventually. But all that hangs around. Do not, trust me from the word of experience, stay up too late before the pre-exam. Because in terms of the study skills that I was talking about earlier, SQ3R, that reading and recitation is the key. And as long as you spend the time there, really all you have to do before an exam is review it and be ready for it. You'll be fine. Okay? So I'm not real sensitive to people who come in and say they've got 5 exams. Well, that I talk about, but that I'll make room for. But somebody who comes in and says, I've got another exam that day, that's life. Okay? Because if you know the material, it's just not a problem. You know it, period. And so one of the keys is be fresh when you go into any major exam or test or anything like that. Another thing that good students are less likely to do is to memorize the text without really understanding the underlying theme or the meaning of what's involved. Any given sentence in a text is probably relatively trivial. And most of them are in sections, and it's really the section headings that you probably ought to be paying attention to in terms of the overall flow of logic, even though, of course, the details of explanation may clearly be involved in the course material itself. Another thing good students are less likely to do is to memorize anything at all. Okay? They will be less likely to have the right answer in the wrong place. Okay? They will have thought about the material enough so that they know what goes where and to have formed some kind of an organizational scheme in terms of what they're going to need for survival in the course. And secondly, they're very unlikely to have their note-taking limited by writing speed. Okay? And that becomes an advantage in 2 ways, because they rarely copy verbatim. What they do is they record themes, concepts, and general ideas, not verbatim. That's in general what they tend to do. I'm slightly off topic here, but there's one other relevant thing to say in the less likely effect, and that is the first day I got in graduate school was in statistics. I talked earlier about math aptitude. The reason I had that was because the instructor in that class was very famous at the University of Iowa as one of the early developers of analysis of variance. I'm that old, but so was he. And in fact, he would lecture each day with these 3 massive green boards and yellow chalk. And he would come in each morning, say good morning, and then turn to the board and start writing. To this day, if I met him on the street, well, he'd be dead, so I'd recognize him. But I would not have recognized him to his face because all I ever saw was the back of his head. If he walked away from me, I'd know him instantly. But the problem was that he wrote very fast and talked very fast. I mean, he could write almost as fast as he could talk. So he would do a full board, do the second board, do the third board, and then he had the only one I've ever seen, an eraser that was at least 15 inches. I'm sure it was built for him. And when he was ready, he would walk back to the beginning of the board, the first board, and simply take that eraser and 3 swipes. And as much words as came off, that was fine. And then he started writing again. The result was, with my bad handwriting, I had to write feverishly just to keep up with him. And then I sat down immediately afterwards and rewrote my notes, which did 2 things. It produced a set of notes that every other graduate student in the department wanted to borrow because I had his notes recorded by the flow of what he was trying to do. And secondly, it was the first day I got in graduate school in stat, which scared me at the time. But it is possible. If you plan ahead and follow the suggestions I've been talking about today, it will be somewhat easier to master material in any class. Good students are more likely to, and these I'd like to spend more focused time on. First of all, to study in the same place. When I described that desk earlier, one of the advantages of a desk is that the chair faces you in a particular direction every time. You may be in an apartment with 1 other roommate, maybe 3 other roommates. The principle is the same, and that is that if you study, always study in the same place. You may have to use the dining room table. That's your assigned spot. Doesn't matter. Make sure that you always use the same information, that you study in the same place. The effect is the same as what I was describing, and that is that if you're there, you know that you're there to study, and that will make life easier for you. The second thing is that you'll also study every day, okay? Every day. Even a little bit will help. We're going to talk at some point in the course about the difference between massed versus distributed studying, okay? And it's been well demonstrated that total time hypothesis does apply within limits, and that is if you have material that you can study straight through or you study only for an hour, that's all you get. You can learn it and remember it more effectively if you will spend 4 times at 15 minutes each than 1 time at 60 minutes each. Why? Why is that? Why is distributed practice better than mass practice with one qualification? And that is that with an artist, if it takes a long time to get set up, it may be easier to run longer in any given session. But in general, for instance, with cognitive activity, such as we're using, why is distributed practice better? Going to be another long pause. Yeah?
Because it puts it in your long-term memory instead of your short-term memory?
You're looking at the positive side. I'm looking for negatives, basically. I don't necessarily agree with your conclusion. And I'll give you an example why. If you look up a telephone number and say it to yourself over and over and over again, you may have to say, if the phone book is in your parents' room and the phone's at the other end of the house, you may have to say that number 25 times. And yet as soon as you dialed it in, you're then thinking about what you're going to say and who you're going to talk to and so forth. And if somebody comes in and says, what number did you dial? You have to walk back. So it isn't necessarily that it's gone into long-term memory, because there's more than just simple repetition that will get it in there. There's some other activities that we're going to talk about during the semester that you'll have to do to get engaged in it. Yeah?
Is it because it's easier to learn and memorize and learn in small sections than it is to learn a lot over one period of time?
That is, yes, a summary of what I've just said, but what I'm asking is why? I mean, I agree, your conclusion is correct, but the question is why? Yeah?
Well, I think I read somewhere that studies show that for learning and all kinds of things, the brain can only take so much at one time, and the longer you study for, the least you retain, and it's basically like the brain has a threshold for learning. Anytime you go over a certain amount of time, your retention is less and less and less.
I would assert that that's a more mechanistic view of learning than I'd really like to encourage. Okay? I would argue that I'm just trying to recapture how you said what you said. But basically, I would disagree with the kind of structuralist analysis that you're arguing with there. I would cite, for instance, the inauguration of President Obama, that in fact that crowd was mesmerized when that event was going on. And that event could have lasted 5 hours and people would have been with him during the time that talk was being given, okay? So I think that one of the things you're ignoring that I would suggest there is content. That if the content is intrinsically interesting to you, you'll stick with it a lot longer than if it's boring.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? So see, now that argues contrary to what you were just saying a minute ago. I don't think it's time limited necessarily. No, I think there's another set of factors you're not looking at. Each of you is citing positives in a way, and it's really the negatives that I would suggest are the biggest problem. And that is that anytime you do anything for an extended period of time, you gradually get tired. Okay? You get overloaded with information. That can be a factor. Okay? But you just get physically tired. And so the motivation level tends to drop, and thus your efficiency in learning the stuff that you're going through also tends to be impacted. And that's the reason, and again, remember the qualifier that I said, that if setup takes a long time, you may want to do it in longer time intervals. But what I'm arguing essentially is that if you hit something 4 times for 15 minutes each, you haven't lost intrinsic interest in it, and you're much more likely to be able to get full measure of learning and retainability. If you do 4 sessions of 15 minutes, that is what's called distributed practice, than if you do just 1 session of an hour. Benton Underwood, back in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's interesting. He had, and I forget the exact number, but he had something like 36 consecutive Roman numeral studies on massed versus distributed practice, demonstrating that distributed practice in 35 out of the 36 studies was the superior way to master the material. Now that was a very old and traditional way of looking at it, but the point that he made quite effectively was that it's still better to distribute your practice insofar as you can. Whoops, that's not the button I meant to push. This is the one I meant to push. That daily schedule that I'm suggesting you keep as a kind of a starting point for your semester is leading into the idea that what people tend to do is to plan their day, okay? They plan how they allocate their time from the beginning. Okay, we also tend to use charts and drawings in their, what I should say is they, tend to use charts and drawings in their reading and use them until they understand them. That is the reason those charts are done. I'll show you a diagram in our next lecture on critical thinking, and there are just an amazing number of things that go into critical thinking. But it's a diagram you have to spend a little bit of time with to really understand what the elements of the diagram are. And in essence, that will aid your learning in the material. If you spend the time in learning the material, using the drawings, and take the time to learn the drawings and the value of them, you'll be better off, a better student. Another thing that good students tend to do, or more likely to do, is look up words. If you don't understand it, don't just assume, well, it'll work out in the reading. Go look it up. And that way, every time it's used, you know exactly what the nuances are of what's involved. Phil, I'm going to stop the tape at this point because people are getting itchy and I've got 9 minutes still to go on the thing. I'd rather add the tape the next time we do it. And I gave him this nice long period of total silence.